You probably think you know what the Soviet Union's darkest secrets look like. Chernobyl, the Gulag, nuclear tests on the steppe. And yes, those are real, and yes, they are terrifying. But they are also the ones they eventually let you see. What we are talking about today are the places they never put on a map, the zones that were erased from official records, the facilities where the work being done was so sensitive that the people doing it were not allowed to tell their own families where they went every morning. Some of these places are ruins now, some are museums, and at least one of them is an active threat to millions of people living within reach of a shifting desert wind, right now, today, as you watch this. We are counting down 13 of the most classified, most visually staggering, and most genuinely dangerous secret zones the USSR ever built, tested, or abandoned. 13 entries, reverse order, and we are not stopping until we reach number 1.
I will tell you this much about number 1. It is not a ruin, it is not contained, and the international biosecurity community has not stopped worrying about it since the Cold War ended. That should be enough to keep you here. From a forest outside Moscow, where artificial lightning bolts once split the air at 9 million volts, to a concrete pyramid that is tracking objects in orbit right now as you sit there, to a hollow mountain with a black underground canal built for submarines to vanish into. These are the places that shaped the world you live in, mostly without your knowledge. Some of what you are about to see will feel impossible. None of it is fiction. Stay until the end. At number 13, we are starting somewhere that most people have never heard of, and that is exactly the point. Hidden inside a dense forest outside the town of Istra, roughly 50 kilometers from the center of Moscow, there is a structure that looks like it was designed by someone who had read too much science fiction and not enough safety documentation. A cascade of enormous transformers, impulse generators, and elevated platforms stretches through the trees, connected by cables thick as a man's arm, and insulated towers rising above the canopy. This was the high-voltage Tesla coil testing range, and Soviet engineers built it in the 1970s for one brutally specific purpose: to generate artificial lightning bolts of up to 9 million volts and fire them directly at real aircraft. Not models, not simulations, actual fuselages, suspended on insulated platforms in the open air, while engineers triggered discharges powerful enough to be heard in villages several kilometers away. The air around the complex reportedly turns so thick with ozone after each test that workers described it as physically difficult to breathe. The goal was to know, with certainty, whether Soviet military jets and civilian airliners could survive a direct lightning strike in flight. The answer, apparently, required doing it thousands of times. After the Soviet collapse, the funding disappeared almost overnight. The machines fell silent. The forest slowly moved back in. Today, the complex sits in various states of rust and decay, still largely intact in its physical structure, which somehow makes it stranger. It is not rubble, it is a frozen moment, a laboratory caught mid-thought. It lands at number 13 because the danger it poses now is essentially zero. But the scale of it, the sheer industrial ambition of building a machine designed to summon lightning on command, inside a forest, next to a town, tells you something important about how Soviet engineers thought. They did not ask whether something was extreme, they asked whether it was necessary. And if we are already at number 13, and the installations are this strange, you should be thinking carefully about what is waiting for you at number 12. At number 12, we go underground. Not metaphorically. 65 meters beneath the streets of central Moscow, directly below a quiet residential district in Taganskaya, there is a city inside a city. And for decades, almost no one who walked above it had any idea it was there. From the outside, the entrance to Bunker 42 looked like an unremarkable two-story mansion from the 19th century. Curtained windows, a modest facade, nothing to draw the eye. But behind those curtains there were no rooms. There was only a concrete wall and a lift shaft descending straight into the earth. Stalin ordered its construction in the early 1950s, and what his engineers built was not a shelter in any ordinary sense. More than 7,000 square meters of corridors, communications rooms, command halls, and living quarters were carved out of the Moscow bedrock, designed to sustain 600 people for 30 days without any connection to the surface. The blast doors weigh several tons each. The communications array could reach targets 1,000 kilometers away, and the entire complex connected directly to the Moscow metro system, meaning that senior military and political staff could arrive, work, and leave without ever appearing above ground, without ever being seen, without leaving any visible trace that anything unusual was happening beneath the city, where millions of people were going about their ordinary lives. What makes Bunker 42 genuinely unsettling is not the hardware, it is the purpose. This was not a place built for survival, it was built for command, for the decisions that would be made in the first hours of a nuclear exchange when the world above had already ended. It is a museum now, open to visitors, and you can walk its corridors and stand in the rooms where those decisions would have been made. But the physical weight of that understanding, the low ceilings, the sealed doors, the absolute silence 65 meters down, does something to a person that no photograph manages to capture. And if a command bunker buried under a capital city feels heavy, wait until we get to number 11, where Soviet engineers decided that a mountain and an open sea were simply raw materials for the next project. At number 11, we leave the underground and go out to sea, and what we find there is something that genuinely stops people mid-sentence when they first see it. Nearly 3 kilometers off the coast of Kaspisk, rising directly from the flat grey surface of the Caspian Sea, a massive concrete structure stands completely alone. No bridge connects it to shore, no boats are permanently moored beside it. It simply exists out there, salt-eaten and enormous, its empty windows staring back at the horizon, like a building that forgot it was supposed to be on land. This was the Dagdizel torpedo testing platform, and the engineering story behind it is almost as striking as the structure itself. Soviet engineers did not drill pilings into the seabed or pour foundations in the traditional sense. They built an enormous wooden caisson on shore, a hollow form the size of a small city block, towed it out into the Caspian, and then deliberately flooded it until it sank and settled on the bottom, creating an artificial island of 5,000 square meters of solid concrete in open water. On top of that foundation, they built a working industrial complex, observation towers, laboratories, dormitories, a canteen, and a library. Engineers and technicians lived there for weeks at a time, completely separated from the mainland, testing torpedo designs through underwater launch tubes built directly into the base of the platform. The year was 1939. The ambition was extraordinary. By 1966, it was over. The Caspian was simply too shallow for the newer, faster weapons the Soviet Navy needed, and the platform was abandoned without ceremony. What remains today is something that exists in a category of its own. Not quite a ruin, not quite a monument, just a structure the sea has been slowly reclaiming for 60 years. You can only reach it by boat in calm weather, and the closer you get, the more it looks like something from a story about a civilization that disappeared overnight. It lands at number 11 because its danger today is essentially zero, but its existence raises a question that stays with you. How many other things did Soviet engineers build in places no one thought to look? Because number 10 has an answer to that, and it is buried under an entire city. At number 10, we go back underground, but this time there is no command center waiting at the bottom, no blast doors, no communications array. What is waiting is something stranger and, in its own way, more haunting. A tunnel that stretches for 21 kilometers in a complete circle beneath the science city of Protvino, south of Moscow, built for a machine that was never finished and a future that never arrived. The project was called the UNK, the Accelerator and Storage Complex, and Soviet physicists began construction in 1983 with a goal that was genuinely audacious. They intended to build a particle accelerator capable of colliding protons at energies of 3,000 gigaelectron volts, which would have surpassed any Western machine by decades. The tunnel alone took years to excavate, running at depths between 20 and 60 meters through the Moscow region bedrock, its circumference roughly matching the entire Moscow Circle line. Hundreds of tons of superconducting magnets were manufactured and installed. Vacuum tubes were laid. The infrastructure of a scientific instrument, unlike anything else on Earth, was taking shape in near total secrecy. And then the Soviet Union collapsed, and the money stopped, and the engineers walked out, and the tunnel was sealed. Today, groundwater has been slowly rising through the concrete floor for more than 30 years. The magnets are corroding in the damp air. When urban explorers have managed to get inside, they describe the acoustics as extraordinary. Footsteps carrying for hundreds of meters through absolute darkness, the echo returning long after the sound was made, as if the tunnel itself is still waiting for something to happen. There is no radiation here, no biological hazard, no active threat of any kind. What number 10 offers instead is something rarer and, in its own way, more difficult to sit with. The precise shape of a future that was cancelled. The machine exists, the tunnel exists, the science it would have produced does not and never will. That particular kind of loss does not have a name, but standing in that flooded corridor in the dark, you would feel it immediately. And if the death of a scientific future feels heavy, wait until number 9, where Soviet engineers carved their ambitions directly into a living mountain. At number 9, we arrive at something that requires a moment to fully process, because the engineering involved is not just impressive, it is almost philosophically aggressive. The city of Balaclava was erased, not destroyed, not evacuated, not reclassified, erased. Removed from every Soviet map, sealed as a closed district of Sevastopol, and surrounded by checkpoints that even Soviet citizens without the correct clearance could not pass through. The reason for all of this was a single structure, Object 825 GTS, a submarine base built not beside a mountain, not beneath a mountain, but inside one. Engineers excavated a navigable canal directly through the living rock of Mount Tavros so that submarines could enter from the open sea while submerged, passing through the mountain itself and emerging into a pressurized interior dock, invisible to any satellite, any reconnaissance aircraft, any eye that was not standing inside the stone. The facility was designed to survive a direct nuclear strike of up to 100 kilotons, which is 5 times the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Beneath hundreds of meters of solid rock, there was a dry dock for full submarine repairs, storage for torpedoes and nuclear warheads, barracks, a hospital, and a bakery. 3,000 personnel could operate there, completely self-sufficient, for 30 days. Construction ran for nearly 10 years, from 1953 to 1961, and 120,000 tons of rock were removed without a single public announcement. It is a museum now, and you can walk the canal on a guided tour. But there is something about standing in that low black corridor with the water beside you and the mountain pressing down from above that no amount of electric lighting can correct. The weight of it is real. The silence in there has a texture. And if a hollow mountain feels like the outer limit of what Soviet engineers were willing to attempt, number 8 will correct that impression immediately, because number 8 is not underground, it is not hidden, and it is watching the sky above your head right now. At number 8, we are no longer talking about something abandoned, rusted, or sealed behind a welded cap. We are talking about something that is operating right now, today, as you read this, as you breathe, as aircraft cross the sky above your city, without a single passenger on board having any idea what is watching them from a forest north of Moscow. Rising out of the trees near the settlement of Sofrino, the Don 2N radar station does not look like a building. It looks like a theorem.
A perfectly geometric truncated pyramid, sides 140 meters long, height exceeding 33 meters, with no windows, no visible entrance, no feature that acknowledges the existence of the human beings who work inside it. The surface is smooth, the angles are exact, and the whole structure sits in its clearing with the quiet, indifferent authority of something that has no interest in being understood by passers-by. It is the only active radar of its type anywhere on Earth. Here is the fact that stops people cold. During a joint exercise with the United States, the Don 2N was given a single task: track objects released from the Space Shuttle Discovery at orbital altitude. The objects were metal spheres, 5 centimeters in diameter, moving at thousands of kilometers per hour against the backdrop of open space. The American radars attempted the same test. The Don 2N succeeded. The American radars did not. Inside that pyramid, an Elbrus supercomputer processes incoming data continuously, scanning 1,000 kilometers of sky for anything moving toward Moscow, calculating trajectories in real time, and doing so without pause, without weekends, without any of the institutional decay that claimed every other location on this list. That is what makes number 8 different from everything above it. Everything else we have visited is history. This is the present. And if a functioning pyramid that tracks objects in orbit feels like the ceiling of what the Soviet Union was capable of building, number 7 is going to remind you that ceilings were never really a concept they took seriously. At number 7, we are talking about a mountain that was supposed to disappear from history entirely, and very nearly did. In the Alsu ravine in the Crimean Mountains, not far from Sevastopol, Soviet engineers spent years hollowing out the interior of a ridge to create Object 221, a reserve command post for the Black Sea Fleet. The entrance was disguised as an ordinary 2-story building, but the windows were not windows. They were painted directly onto the concrete, black rectangles on a flat wall. A facade with nothing behind it except portals wide enough to drive a Kamaz truck through. Beyond those portals, 4 underground floors descended roughly 200 meters into the earth, connected by corridors that seemed to go on without logical end, vertical lift shafts and spiral staircases that led to levels where the air pressure changed as you went deeper. When the Soviet Union dissolved, the facility was nearly 90% complete. This was not a skeleton. Cables had been laid, life support systems were installed and functional, furniture was being moved in. Workers were applying decorative mosaics to the interior walls. Then the guards left, and what followed was one of the most thorough acts of industrial stripping ever recorded on the peninsula. Everything removable was removed. Multi-ton blast doors were cut from their frames and hauled out. Copper wiring was pulled from the walls. Steel fittings, ventilation ducts, lighting fixtures, all of it gone. What remains is bare concrete descending into absolute darkness, with vertical shafts that offer no railing, no warning, and no bottom you can see from the edge. People have gone in and not come back out. The scale of what was built here and the completeness of what was taken sits in a register that is genuinely difficult to describe. And if a hollowed mountain, stripped to its bones, feels like the outer edge of Soviet ambition gone wrong, number 6 is going to show you what happens when Soviet ambition went right, and the result was somehow more disturbing. At number 6, we arrive at something that looks, from satellite imagery, almost too perfect to be real. A circle cut into the Kazakh steppe, 400 meters in diameter, 100 meters deep, filled with water so still it reflects the sky like a mirror. It is geometrically exact in a way that nature does not produce, and it should not exist at all.
On January 15, 1965, Soviet scientists detonated a thermonuclear device with a yield of 140 kilotons beneath the surface of the steppe near the Chagan River. 9 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb, directed not at an enemy, but at the ground itself. The purpose was something Soviet planners called a peaceful nuclear explosion, and they meant that phrase without irony. The theory was straightforward. If a bomb can destroy a city, perhaps a bomb can also dig a reservoir, redirect a river, reshape geography on a scale that conventional engineering could never match. The Chagan test was the proof of concept. The crater it left was connected by canal to the river, and the world's first atomic lake was born. The minister overseeing the project swam in it on camera. Fish were introduced, and they survived. But they grew to abnormal sizes and developed malformed jaws and deformed internal organs. The sediment at the bottom of the crater had fused into a layer of radioactive glass. Today, radiation levels on the crater rim still exceed safe limits by dozens of times, more than half a century later. What makes Atomic Lake Chagan sit at number 6 is not just the danger, though the danger is real and measurable. It is the logic behind it. This was not an accident, not a miscalculation, not a disaster anyone was trying to prevent. It was a plan. A considered, funded, officially sanctioned plan to use nuclear weapons as construction equipment. And the lake it produced is still there, still radioactive, still perfectly circular, still beautiful in photographs, which is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. If a lake created by a thermonuclear explosion feels like the point where ambition crosses into something else entirely, number 5 is going to take you somewhere quieter, and in its own way, far more heartbreaking. At number 5, we arrive at something that does not fit neatly into any category of danger or disaster, and that is precisely what makes it so difficult to leave behind. On the slopes of Mount Aragats in Armenia, at an altitude of 1,700 meters, a concrete bowl 54 meters in diameter is embedded directly into the mountainside. It is not a crater. It was not forced into the earth by anything violent. It was placed there, deliberately, by human hands, over more than a decade of construction that ran from 1975 to 1987. Inside the bowl, 4,000 polished aluminium mirrors are arranged in an interlocking pattern, each one individually angled to focus incoming signals toward a secondary reflector suspended on steel frames above the dish. The effect, when the light catches it right, is extraordinary, something between a flower and an eye, scaled up to the size of a city block and aimed at the sky. This was the mirror radio telescope designed by the Soviet physicist Paris Harouni, and its purpose was not military, not strategic, not defensive. It was built to listen. Harouni designed it to be the most sensitive radio telescope ever constructed, capable of detecting signals from supernovae and pulsars at distances that conventional instruments could not reach. And in his most ambitious vision, which he stated openly and without apology, it was built to hear transmissions from other civilizations. When it was commissioned, its sensitivity was genuinely without equal anywhere on Earth. Then the Soviet Union ended. The funding stopped. The staff dispersed. Today, the mirrors still catch the light, but no one is reading the data. The control building stands empty, instrument panels grey with dust, windows broken, the hum of electronics long gone. What sits at number 5 is not a contaminated lake or a hollow mountain or a pyramid tracking objects in orbit. It is a question that was being asked by one of the most sophisticated instruments ever built. And the question is still there, unanswered, because the civilization that built the instrument to ask it ceased to exist before the answer could come. That particular kind of silence is its own category of haunting. And if the death of a question feels heavy, wait until number 4, where Soviet engineers went looking for answers in the opposite direction entirely, not outward toward the stars, but straight down into the Earth itself, deeper than any human being had ever gone before. At number 4, we are standing in the tundra of the Murmansk region, in front of something that should not be able to stop you in your tracks, and yet it does. It is a metal cap, roughly the diameter of a dinner plate, welded shut over a pipe sunk into the ground. No fence around it, no monument, no sign that adequately explains what is underneath. Beneath that cap lies the deepest hole ever drilled by human beings, 12,262 meters, deeper than the Mariana Trench is wide. Soviet engineers began drilling here in 1970, and the goal was not oil, not gas, not any resource with a market value. The goal was to understand what the Earth is actually made of, to push a drill through the crust and find out whether the models geologists had built over a century of theory were correct. At the depths they eventually reached, pressure exceeded 1,000 atmospheres and temperatures surpassed 200 degrees Celsius. Drill bits did not wear down. They dissolved. Steel cables snapped under their own weight before they could reach the bottom. The project continued for more than 20 years, and what it returned from those depths overturned assumptions that had stood for generations. Water appeared at levels where no water was supposed to exist. Microscopic fossilized organisms, 2 billion years old, were found in rock that had supposedly never supported life. The planet, it turned out, had not read the textbooks. In the West, tabloid newspapers eventually claimed that Soviet scientists had lowered a microphone into the shaft and recorded the screams of souls in hell. That story was fabricated entirely. But here is the thing. The real discoveries were stranger than the myth, and that is not a sentence that gets to be true very often. After a series of accidents and the end of Soviet funding, the drilling rig was demolished, the research center left to collapse under snow and rust, and that small welded cap was pressed into place over the deepest wound ever made in the surface of the Earth. It sits at number 4 because the legend and the genuine science have become almost impossible to separate, and because there is something quietly extraordinary about the fact that the most dramatic object the Soviets left in that tundra is something you could step over without noticing. Number 3 will not let you step over anything. Number 3 is a place the Earth itself seems to be refusing to forget. At number 3, the ground itself is the problem. In the valley of the Ditirin River on the Kolyma Peninsula, in one of the most remote and punishing corners of the Russian Far East, the indigenous Evenki people had a name for this place that translated roughly as the bad place or the Valley of Death. They had no instruments to measure what made it bad. They simply knew, across generations, that animals behaved strangely here, that the land felt wrong, and that you did not linger. Soviet authorities chose it in the late 1940s for a uranium mining camp, one of the most classified nodes in the entire Gulag archipelago, where prisoners extracted ore for the first Soviet atomic bomb. Radiation safety was not a consideration. Men worked in the shafts without respirators, without protective clothing, handling uranium ore with bare hands, breathing dust that was slowly destroying them from the inside. Life expectancy at Butugichag was measured in months, not years. What makes this place different from every other camp in the Gulag system is that it never fully closed in any meaningful sense. The guards left, the prisoners were gone, but the contamination stayed. The stone barracks and punishment cells still stand on the hillside above the processing facility, built from the local rock, which is itself radioactive. The earth around them is almost entirely bare, grey and scorched looking, as if the land is still reacting to something. Metal scavengers who strip abandoned Soviet sites across Russia, people who will take anything with market value and ask no questions, leave Butugichag untouched. They know what the metal here has absorbed. Radiation levels in certain areas still exceed safe limits by hundreds of times, nearly 70 years after the last prisoner was marched out. What sits at number 3 is the intersection of two of the darkest forces the 20th century ever produced: the Gulag and the nuclear arms race, fused together in one valley that the Evenki knew to avoid long before anyone understood why. The earth has not forgiven it. And if a place that the ground itself refuses to heal sits at number 3, you should be asking yourself what could possibly be worse. Number 2 has an answer, and it is sitting on the shore of an Arctic sea right now. At number 2, we are 55 kilometers from the Norwegian border, on the shore of the Barents Sea, and what is sitting there has been described by international nuclear safety experts not as a historical problem, but as an ongoing one. Andreeva Bay was established in the 1960s as a refueling base for Soviet nuclear submarines, a routine facility by the standards of the Cold War. But by the 1980s, routine had quietly become catastrophic. In 1982, a crack appeared in the wall of building number 5, the structure where thousands of spent nuclear fuel assemblies were being stored underwater in cooling pools. Radioactive water began seeping directly into the Barents Sea. The response was not a controlled emergency operation. It was improvisation under pressure. The assemblies were pulled from the failing pool and placed into whatever containers were available: metal drums, concrete blocks, makeshift enclosures left in the open Arctic air to face the wind, the salt, the freeze-thaw cycles of a subarctic coastline. Decade after decade, those containers sat there corroding. When international inspectors finally got access in the early 2000s, the language in their reports was careful, the way language always gets careful when the people writing it are genuinely alarmed. Radiation levels in certain zones were lethal to unprotected personnel. Containers were failing. The margin between what was there and a contamination event comparable in scale to Chernobyl, but releasing into an ocean rather than an atmosphere, was not a comfortable one. Cleanup operations are still happening. Workers in the highest-rated protective suits and remote-controlled robots handle material that no human being can safely approach directly. The question of how much the Barents Sea has already absorbed does not have a clean answer. And the scientists who study it will tell you so plainly. That is what puts Andreeva Bay at number 2. Not what happened, what is still happening. And if an Arctic coastline still being actively cleaned of nuclear contamination feels like the ceiling of this list, number 1 is going to prove that ceilings were never something the Soviet Union believed in. At number 1, we arrive at a place that is not quite an island anymore, and that is the entire problem. Vozrojdeniya Island sat in the middle of the Aral Sea, and for decades it was one of the most classified coordinates in the Soviet military system. The codenames were Aralsk 7 and Polygon Barkhan. A closed military city called Kantubek was built there, home to around 1,500 people, with schools, a park, a stadium, comfortable housing for officers and scientists. A few kilometers away, behind wire fencing, was the facility where the most dangerous pathogens ever weaponized were developed, modified, and tested on living animals tethered in the open steppe, exposed to aerosol clouds of anthrax, plague, tularemia, and weaponized smallpox released from aircraft. In 1971, a research vessel passed too close to an active test zone. Weaponized smallpox reached the mainland by wind. 5,000 people required emergency vaccination within 2 weeks. That incident remained classified for decades. In 1988, as the Soviet collapse approached, hundreds of tons of anthrax spores were transported to Vozrojdeniya and buried in shallow pits in the sandy soil, mixed with bleach, improperly decontaminated, and left. Then the Aral Sea continued to shrink, as it had been shrinking since Soviet irrigation projects diverted its feeder rivers in the 1960s. By the early 2000s, the water had retreated so far that Vozrojdeniya was no longer an island. It had merged with the mainland on both sides. The wire fencing, the shallow burial pits, the anthrax spores that survived the bleach treatment, all of it now connected by dry land to open steppe, to grazing animals, to human settlements, to wind patterns that shift with the seasons. Kantubek is a ghost city in a salt desert. The vehicles are still there, the documents were left where they fell, and somewhere beneath that sand, the material that Soviet scientists spent decades engineering to be resistant, persistent, and lethal is waiting for conditions that nobody can fully predict or control. That is why it sits at number 1, not because of what happened there, because of what has not happened yet. 13 locations, 1 collapsed superpower, and a legacy that is still unfolding in real time, in salt deserts, in Arctic bays, in forests outside Moscow, where the machines have gone quiet, but the questions have not. What this list keeps returning to, underneath every rusted transformer and every flooded tunnel and every welded cap in the tundra, is a single uncomfortable truth. The Soviet Union did not just build things, it built things that outlasted itself. And some of those things are still making decisions on our behalf, whether we are paying attention or not. A pyramid tracking objects in orbit, anthrax spores in sandy soil, connected to open steppe by a shoreline that used to be a sea, a nuclear coastline still being cleaned by robots because human hands cannot safely go near it. These are not history lessons. They are current events wearing the costume of history. And the difference matters. If any part of this changed the way you think about what the Cold War actually left behind, or if one of these 13 places genuinely stopped you cold, I want to know which one. Leave it in the comments. I read them, and the answers are always more interesting than I expect. If you are new here, and this is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing takes about 2 seconds, and it means you will not miss what comes next. There is always something that comes next. Thank you for staying until the end. That is exactly where the important part lives.